Hello from New York, I'm Chris Hayes. Oakland police arrested an estimated 300 people at an Occupy protest, including a reporter from Mother Jones magazine. And 2 days before the Florida primary, Rick Santorum has left the state to be with his 3-year-old daughter, who's been hospitalized for undisclosed reasons. Herman Cain has endorsed Newt Gingrich for president, and we'll be talking about the race today. And right now, joining me, we have Democratic Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee, one of my favorite members of the United States Congress, rejoining us here on Up. Playwright Esther Armah, the host of Wake Up Call on WBAI here in New York. Elise Jordan, former speechwriter for Secretary of State Condoleeza Rice, former contributor to the National Review and The Daily Beast. And Victoria deFrancesco Soto, communications director for Latino Decisions and faculty fellow at the University of Texas, Austin. It's great to have you all here. So there's a lot to talk about, particularly as pertaining to the Republican field, which is entering a kind of, I think fair to say, make or break battle in Florida, particularly for Newt Gingrich trying to challenge Mitt Romney to be the nominee. The seesaw game in Florida has tipped in the direction of Mitt Romney, particularly over, I would say, the last week or so. To give you an idea how up and down this last week has been, take a look at this graph. Real Clear Politics, which I can never get out on air, has taken the average data of 5 GOP presidential primary polls, and from that we can see Newt Gingrich went from being ahead by 7 percentage points to being down 8 percentage points. What has happened in that time in between is the GOP establishment has come out en masse in support of Mitt Romney. And to drive the stake through the heart of the Gingrich campaign, the Romney camp has released an attack ad against Gingrich, highlighting his ethics violations. The ad features this excerpt from an NBC nightly news broadcast from 1997.
Good evening. Newt Gingrich, who came to power, after all, preaching a higher standard in American politics, a man who brought down another speaker on ethics accusations. Tonight, he has on his own record the judgment of his peers, Democrat and Republican alike, by an overwhelming vote. They found him guilty of ethics violations. They charged him a very large financial penalty, and several of them raised serious questions about his future effectiveness.
That clip, from which we took directly from Nightly News, is being used in an ad by Mitt Romney. The NBC has objected to it. They've written a letter to the campaign. Tom Brokaw's issued a statement saying that he's very uncomfortable with him being marshaled in this fashion. But what I think is so fascinating here, and Victoria, I'd like you to weigh in on this since you are a political scientist by training. There's been some debate on the internet about this book by who the name of the author escapes me, called The Party Decides, which basically makes the case that primaries fundamentally are establishment endeavors, that basically the party establishment decides who the nominee is going to be. And there's been this, I think, split, particularly in people following this race, about whether that holds true here or whether we're going to see a genuine insurgency. And I feel like the establishment of the GOP has come down like a ton of bricks in the past week to do everything possible to stop Newt Gingrich from being the nominee. And right now, it looks like it's working. Of course, this is the second time they've done it, and Newt was able to come back from the dead the last time. What's your feeling watching this in terms of the legitimacy of that as the sort of predictive theory for how the nominee is chosen?
So historically, we do know that the establishment matters. But 2 years ago, in 2010,
right,
the election, we saw all of the rules change. Everything was just thrown out the window. So we have to take this 2012 election in light of the 2010 election, the Tea Party. You have this mobilized base, this disgruntled base of folks who said, you know what? We're not happy with the president right now for whatever reason, and we are going to make sure that our voice is heard, and we don't care if it offends the establishment. So that's what we're seeing, and Newt Gingrich is the perfect person to do that, because he's not going to let go. He's going to keep on fighting, and he's going to keep on giving them that voice.
Well, that's interesting. He's the perfect person to do it by disposition, but not by biography. Meaning, he is an incredibly unlikely anti-establishment figure. The man makes $3 million a year, essentially giving speeches about policy, peddling influence, being a historian for Fannie Freddie, living inside the Beltway. The only times I've ever seen Newt Gingrich in person are at green rooms of cable news stations. I mean, this is not exactly like...
But his narrative, and I don't mean this in an offensive way, but he's a performance artist.
Yes.
He's a fabulous performance artist. And it really doesn't matter what you are. It's what you appear to be. And he appears to be this very angry, populist man of the people.
But Newt matters because he makes Mitt better. It's like
that is a fascinating point.
It's like the hip-hop track by Fabulous featuring Neo. The track is called You Make Me Better. And up until particularly the Florida debate, Mitt was really kind of, sort of, the aristocracy of mediocrity. He was stunningly average.
Yes.
And Newt forces him to elevate his game. And Newt is that brawler, boxer who it may be the very last punch he'll ever throw, but he's still going to try and land one on your nose and knock you out.
I think
and Mitt needs Newt in order to elevate his game. Because up until that point, he really was, he was so flip-flopping, he was apologizing for his wealth. He wasn't offering those traditional Republican success narratives that work. And so I think part of what Newt's job is for the establishment is to actually make Mitt presentable as the candidate.
He makes Mitt a savior.
Yeah.
So he becomes the nominee. They'll go, well, it could have been Newt. So then the Republicans all kind of like, we have somebody. And some of the others are going to think, he's nuts. He could have been that Neanderthal.
Right. Well, here's the question I want to ask you actually about your experience in this, but I want to follow up on this point because I think that's a great and very astute point. That there's a parallel, I think, to Barack Obama in 2008, which is people forget he did not do very well in a lot of those debates. Remember, there's an endless series of debates, and people said he couldn't throw a punch. There were all sorts of opportunities where he really could have, stuck it to Hillary Clinton, and he just clearly didn't relish that role. Mm-hmm. But the number of debates and the combativeness and the political dexterity of Hillary Clinton in forcing confrontations with him made him a much better debater. I mean, I think it's generally accepted that he came out of that far better at campaigning and at debating than he when he went in.
Well, and Romney was a changed man on Thursday night.
Absolutely.
He was just going out and punching. And it also, with Newt, with the whole... It brings up this weird issue of class warfare within the Republican Party because Newt is almost, I think, jealous of Romney having like uber wealth, and Newt's, more of a kind of speaking circuit, post-politician, political style wealth. And so they're debating.
He's a more like average Joe millionaire. Not one, and Romney's 1% of the 1%. Right.
But it's this weird class warfare that comes out when Newt's trying to attack him for a blind trust, and they're talking about blind trust during a Republican debate, and it just hits this level of just so bizarre, and you realize that there's this anger within Republicans even.
So are they going to turn out, though? That's the question. Romney will be the nominee. If I were betting woman, I'd put my money on Romney. But is this space going to turn out those people who are hanging on to Newt? He may be down in the polls, but he still has 18% of those folks. Nationally, he's still up. Remember, Florida, he's down, but he's up by about 4 points nationally. What's going to happen with them? Right. Are they going to turn out, or are they just going to stay home?
Well, Newt believes he's the better candidate than Mitt Romney, no matter what the establishment
may try and
convey that.
Yes, he believes a lot of things.
Right.
But the fact of his belief carries his conviction in the debates. Like, he comes to the debate with this specificity, this clarity, and this conviction that has given him an authenticity where Mitt was kind of flip-flopping all over the place. Now, Mitt has taken over that curveball, and the fact that Mitt Romney will take Florida is not going to impact the bruiser of Newt moving through the primaries undeterred.
I think that's actually the question, right? I mean, and I think it has to do with two things. It has to do with momentum and it has to do with money. I mean, the best chance I think Newt had at actually upsetting the apple cart and making a real play for the nomination would be to parlay the momentum that was coming out of the South Carolina victory into a win in Florida. And if he were to win on Tuesday, I think we genuinely have a whole new race. I mean, then it really is something new. If he loses, the question is, does he fade away? Does the establishment rally behind Romney? Does billionaire casino magnate Sheldon Adelson, who we talked about yesterday on the program, say, here's another $20 million, keep going, I really like what you're up to? I mean, that seems to me the operative question.
He's not letting go.
No.
I mean, it's his mission.
Absolutely not.
And the thing about Newt Gingrich is he's going to drive the agenda. He may recognize he's not in it to win it, but he's like, at least I'm going to make Mitt Romney talk about what I want to talk about. He's going to take him off message. So if Romney wants to talk about one thing, he'll move it over here.
We are talking about the moon from now until April.
It's so upsetting to me because I think that Newt Gingrich has been so destructive to the Republican Party. Just the fact that he had the audacity to suggest that poor preteen children should be janitors. That's a really disturbing statement. He wasn't talking about rich kids. He wasn't talking about middle-class kids. Right. He was suggesting that poor children that they need to do that for whatever reason. I just think it's horrible. And I think that statement alone, Republicans should be just appalled.
But isn't that the flip? I mean, I agree, although I'm not speaking from inside the tent. But it also seems to me that that's actually that's the other side of the coin of his appeal. I mean, the New York Times ran a great piece, I think it's in the paper today, about Newt Gingrich's appeal. And a lot of it has to do, he's appealing to the emotional, visceral anger, discontent of the roiling Republican base. I want to get your thoughts on that. And you, Congressman, I want to hear how you navigate the tricky world of giving endorsements in a season like this, right after we come back. Northeastern elite that we are. Talking about how wonderful it is to have two Southerners on our program here today. Congressman, the reason I wanted to come to you was watching the mechanics that Victoria and I were discussing in terms of the way in which a primary is negotiated between the base and the sort of party elites and party establishment and donor class and sitting politicians. What's been interesting to see this coordinated wave of elected officials, Bob Dole coming out and writing an open letter, current members of Congress, people that serve with Newt Gingrich, all coming out to say, do not nominate Newt Gingrich. This would be a disaster. How do you negotiate as an elected representative when you have a very contested, intense primary in your own party, as there was in 2008 on the Democratic side? How do you negotiate the politics of that?
Well, it's difficult, especially when you have friends. Both people are friends. I'm very friendly with the Clintons, and nobody do I admire more than Hillary and Bill Clinton. But I really was taken with Barack Obama, and Barack Obama was, I think, a generational figure, and he was in 2008, and I think he still is. And so it made it difficult. The politics of it in my district is Barack Obama's and Hillary both were very popular, but Barack was more popular. And but it's amazing in this situation, you've got people like Sarah Palin and Kaine jumping on what I would consider the Titanic, but I'm not booking their passage. And, you know, their travel agent.
Right. In terms of Sarah Palin has now very clearly allied herself with the Gingrich campaign. Herman Cain endorsing Newt Gingrich yesterday. But is it a calculation? Just sketch out what are the factors involved. It's personal affinity. It's a political calculation about where your district is. It's a calculation about where your connections and friends and donors are. I mean, how do you sort of compute all that as you're deciding?
But it's all of that. I mean, you've got to consider where your constituency is, and I think that's the main thing when you're an elected official. And you've also got to take your heart. And sometimes the two things go together, and sometimes they don't. When they don't go together, you've got to make a real profiles and courage decision sometimes. But when they go together, just like politics and policy go together, it's the best of all possible worlds.
If you were a Republican right now, would you be doing the same thing? Would you be going around warning your electorate that Newt Gingrich would be a disaster?
I think it'd be what kind of Republican you are. And this is the cocktail party Republicans versus the Tea Party Republicans. And the Tea Party Republicans, they love Paul Revere and they like to sound the alarm. And I don't know if they're that tuned into electoral politics. They'd love to have their president, but they may take it to a third party. Newt's not going to quit. And the Tea Party's not going to quit, and I don't think they're going to fall in love. When you get the situation we've got now, where you've got the Tea Party people behind a twice-divorced Roman Catholic who's admitted to adultery, who's being financed by two Jewish people in the casino business, you can see they're not real wild about having a Mormon as the head of their ticket, or an African-American as president either.
You know, I'm not sure. John McCain himself basically made the point that there was some in the South Carolina result. There was some sort of anti-Mormon backlash. But it seems to me that Newt Gingrich is just kind of the right person at the right time to just sit there and collect all the anti-Romney sentiment from whatever the motivation of the base is.
Well, I mean, they did polling after the South Carolina primary. It showed, I think, that if religious belief was important to you, you favored Newt over Romney. And so I think that within South Carolina, certainly religion was sadly still very much an issue. And I think that right now, like, he is just the repository of all of this anger. And that's what's upsetting, because he doesn't, represent an ideas-driven movement. He represents anger, which is really scary and a very negative spiral, I think, for the Republican Party to pursue.
But there is a power to that anger, because that was what created the Tea Party.
Yes.
And that is what Newt incorporates.
Yes.
So there is an entire segment of the population that feels a connection, a complete understanding through listening to Newt and through hearing what he's saying, and like, that's the point that I want to make, and stick it to him, Newt. There's a real specific channeling of that anger, and he feeds that. It feeds him too. And so, honestly, we need Newt to keep the debates interesting.
But I guess I would say there's positive anger and there's negative anger. And
I'm not saying the anger is positive. I'm saying the anger is powerful.
Yes. Exactly, the anger certainly
is different.
On Thursday night, we saw Mitt Romney. He took the gloves off, and he did great at the debate. But before then, he'd been just flagging. And it was Newt Gingrich who really was the power player. And I think there was a lot of hunger in the South Carolina primary and in general to see somebody who could go toe-to-toe with Barack Obama. And I think that also fueled it. We want to see somebody who can have that matchup in November.
That's clearly the source of a lot of his appeal. And in fact, I think his main campaign selling point is his stump speech line about I'll challenge Obama to 95 Lincoln Douglas debates or whatever the heck it is, and I'll even let him use a teleprompter. This is his big applause line on the stump. But that argument is really, it's hard to sell that argument if you actually don't do very well at the debate, like you did Thursday night. It's sort of self-refuting if you're going around saying, the reason you should elect me your nominee is how great I am as a debater, and also I had a really bad debate.
Well, I think that Thursday night really helped Romney a lot because he showed that he had something in his core, and he had some fire in his belly, which had been so miserably lacking by playing it so safe, by being so poll-tested. And so the fact that he could get up there and show some anger, because Republicans want ideas, and they want the same kind of, look at Barack Obama's success. Like, he started a movement. It was hopeful, it was change, it was this and that, and they want to, they need a similar kind of inspirational figure right now.
That is the question. Do they want ideas or do they want anger? And that relates to something I want to talk about next, which is where the GOP is with regards to Latinos in this country, and that's been front and center as we've entered into Florida. We're going to talk about that right after this. Can Republicans win over Latino voters? This was the question that seemed placed in front and center as the campaign moved into Florida, where more than 1 in 5 residents are Latino. The GOP has an uphill battle for some pretty obvious reasons. Mitt Romney has said he would veto the DREAM Act, except for the small portion that gives young people a path to citizenship in return for military service. Newt Gingrich earlier insinuated that Spanish is, quote, the language of the ghetto, though later said he wasn't talking about Spanish. You're left to guess yourself what language he was talking about, Flemish perhaps, or something like that. But now the GOP is in Florida. The candidates need to frantically throw the rhetorical car in reverse to back out of the electoral dead end of hysteria and demagoguery they'd driven down during their trips through Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. And there was a moment in Thursday night's debate I thought perfectly embodied the awkwardness of the GOP field as they attempt to pull off this pivot, right? They've been traipsing around different states where the electorate they're speaking to is almost entirely white. All of a sudden, they have to make this switch, and the red meat that they were sort of, offering in the earlier states is no longer. They can't quite do that. So it reminded me. The moment I want to play you from the debate. First, I want to play this, which it reminded me of this sketch from Funny or Die with Rachel Dratch. Check it out.
Okay, here's how this segment of Get Into a Snuggie with Billy is going to work. You are going to have 30 seconds to name 20 white people. You have to name 20 white people in 30 seconds. Are you ready, Rachel? Put 30 seconds on the clock.
Oh, my God.
And away we go.
Okay, Amy Poehler.
Correct.
Tina.
Correct.
Polly Shannon.
Correct.
Seth Meyers.
Correct.
Lauren Michaels.
Correct.
Daryl Hammond.
Correct.
I'm just naming SNL people.
That's fine. They count as white.
Oh my God, 5 seconds?
Yes.
You, me, my mom, my dad, my brother.
Time, did you get it? No, Rachel, you couldn't name 20 white celebrities.
All right, Rachel Dratch could not name 20 white celebrities in 30 seconds. So GOP candidates, can you name 20 Latino politicians in 30 seconds? Go.
Marco Rubio is a pretty impressive guy.
Susana Martinez, somebody like Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. And I actually thought about Marco Rubio.
Brian Sandoval, Susana Martinez in New Mexico, both of the Diaz-Balart brothers, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, Mel Martinez, Carlos Gutierrez.
I'll give a shout out to Governor Luis Fortuño.
This to me was this sort of like no subtext, lowest common denominator pandering. I mean, I understand because it's politics, and there was a question: what Latinos would you think of for your cabinet? But there was literally a moment where it just seemed like Mitt Romney was just calling to mind Latino Republicans.
Like Diaz, Gonzalez.
Yes, exactly.
Garcia.
Did the awkwardness of the tone strike you as you were watching this debate? That this outreach, which they're now pivoting to try to do because they understand what the electoral math is, but they have all the baggage built up from what they've been saying in all the other states.
They don't have that much baggage to deal with in Florida. They'll have going forward. But Florida is a very interesting state because it's the exception that confirms the Latinos as Democrats rules. Latinos generally are Democrats or lean Democrats, with the exception of Florida, of Cubans in Florida. And this is for historical reasons. The folks who came over from Cuba in 1959 and thereafter were fleeing communism. They came under the Republican tent, whatnot. But what we see here is a very strong Republican support among Cuban Americans. Cuban Americans are slightly more than half of the Latino electorate, 51%. Pretty solid Republican vote there, too. So for these folks, immigration isn't an issue.
Right.
You know, you have citizenship, your grandparents have citizenship, it's not an issue. I'm not saying that Cuban Americans don't care and they want to deport everyone, but it's not a big issue to them. And then you have the Puerto Rican population that's growing, and among that population, we're starting to see some Democratic leanings. So in the general, we're going to see Latinos play a much bigger role, but for the primary, Cubans are solidly Republican.
But here's to me is the interesting. And you wrote a really good piece for The Nation magazine that I really liked, and actually was a good check for me because I can fall in this trap as well, where you said, you know, Latino voters are human beings who care about many issues and not just immigration, like all other people, like all other citizens. In fact, the economy in the polling that you've been doing it now outranks immigration as the issue. But to me, there's kind of two things we need to distinguish, which is the issue set, the substantive concerns about the economy, about foreign policy, whatever it is, healthcare, and then there's the cultural vibe the Republican Party gives off, right? There's the rhetoric it engenders. And I think what it seemed to me is whatever the substantive concerns are, even if you think, we need to balance a budget, it's hard to go along with a party you feel is fundamentally hostile to people like you, right?
And that's why we're not going to see any move by the Republican Party in the general go towards Latinos. This is not the Bush era. Bush was very friendly to Latinos. I mean, coming out of Texas, they loved him.
And it's such a tragedy that in 2006 his immigration reform wasn't passed.
Right.
Bush, I mean, he really was such a leader, and he understood the importance of Republicans, of making it an encompassing party for everyone.
Well,
and Jeb Bush,
and that was brother
week,
too,
had an amazing op-ed in the Washington Post that I think is so important, and the Republican Party should really heed. Just saying, like, let's not make this about a culture. Let's not make this a cultural issue. Let's focus on the economics. Let's, or let's not make this about security.
Right.
He said, let's focus on the economic issues and really pointing to educational reform.
The trouble is, making it about security also panders to a very specific base within the Republican Party. It just works as populist politics.
Right, exactly.
And so because
there's an appetite for it.
Absolutely, and the appetite grows and gets bigger and is explosive, and so that's what's being fed. And so you always have the difference between the culture of the Republican Party, the symbol of reaching out to, the symbolic reality of reaching out to Latinos, and the substantive power of that populist base. And how do you balance that?
More about the GOP and Latino voters after we take this break.
Well, first, we got to have a fence. Secondly,
the whole fence, 2,600 miles.
We got to have a fence. I don't see how it is that a state like Texas, to go to University of Texas, if you're an illegal alien, you get an in-state tuition discount. And then you have states, the big states of illegal immigrants are California and Florida. Over the last 10 years, they've had no increase in illegal immigration. We've got to stop illegal immigration. That means turning off the magnets of amnesty, in-state tuition for illegal aliens, employers that knowingly hire people that have come here illegally.
That's a little montage of Mitt Romney, who we've talked about quite a bit on the show, has delighted in using immigration as one of the few issues where he can sort of plausibly and credibly get to the right of his contestants in the GOP nominee battle, and Rick Perry specifically. I think he made a tactical decision to go after Rick Perry on immigration because it bought him tactical victories in the short term, but might be a strategic error in the long run. And Victoria, I'm curious the degree to which you think that kind of rhetoric with all those sort of dog whistles, amnesty and illegals, to what extent he can walk that back or run away from it in the general election.
First, I wanted to address, Chris, for just a second, what he said in that excerpt about the magnets of in-state tuition. How come you didn't say jobs?
Right.
The reason folks come here and they risk their lives crossing the border is because there are American employers who want to hire them. Right. So this tough talk on immigrants totally ignores the fact that they're coming here because there's a magnet here. And moving forward in terms of how can you walk this back, he can't do a 180, obviously. He's not going to be the Bush era, the Jeb Bush kind of immigration-friendly candidate, but he's going to soften. He's going to soften at the edges. We saw it in Iowa. He said that he would veto the DREAM Act. A couple days later, well, there's a caveat to that. I would allow it if it allowed for military service. And we're going to keep seeing a bunch of caveats tacked on. That's the only way he's going to have to do it. I also think he might use surrogates to help him. So at the state level, some Latino Republicans, he might use even the Mormon Church, because the Mormon Church is very immigrant friendly.
Yes.
They very much believe in keeping the family together and the free market and immigration flows.
There are a lot of Latino Mormons. I mean,
that's the fastest growing demographic of the Mormon Church are Latinos.
Yeah. And isn't part of the problem with Romney is that, all politicians have to do some political positioning, some jockeying and some shifting. And he's just not very sophisticated about how he ever politically positions himself. So he seems to move very clumsily, hence the flip-flopper term that has stuck to him. And so that when he does start to pull back, because every politician does, as it moves towards now you're facing the president as opposed to Newt and Ron Paul and Rick Santorum, now you're having to have a different conversation. But his lack of sophistication about how he moves,
right, he does it more clumsily. I think that's
very clumsily. Right. I just also wanted to add, there was a series that started this week called The United States of Unemployment on Salon.com. And it was talking to a whole group of folk, disparate, older, white, Jewish, Latino, Latina, a whole range of people who had been long-term unemployed. And we're talking about how they were becoming more radicalized as a direct result of the economy. And so you have still this element of the Republicans that only speaks to the most homogenous, broadest elements of the Latino base. Doesn't even get into the reality that Florida is, you're talking about Cuban exiles versus Puerto Ricans, which, you know what I mean, it's a sophisticated space. But when you look at the series that are happening online, they're talking about jobs, the economy, the foreclosure crisis, and the disproportionate ways those are impacting brown and black communities.
And you've done some polling on this, right?
Yes.
I mean, you do polling on and what have you found?
We have found that the number one issue for Latinos is the economy. It's jobs. Pew just came out with a report earlier this week saying that I think over 60% of Latinos had either been unemployed themselves or somebody in their household had been unemployed in the last year.
Right. Well, and Pew also in the poll, it said that illegal immigration has dropped 60% from 2006 to 2011 because it's
the magnet
in response to not here.
But of course, the irony, I mean, that highlights exactly why the issue of immigration as an issue is a kind of set of embedded cultural signifiers, right? Because it isn't just immigration, how many people are coming in. It's about all sorts of nostalgia for an America that has been lost. It's about this sort of sense of the worry about America's future and decline and no longer being a majority white nation. There's all these things bound up in that concern that don't have to do with how many people came in 2009, how many people came in 2010, 2011, and that's the reason. That's the exact same reason it resonates. Right? It doesn't resonate in Iowa because of how large it looms as a substantive issue for everyone, right? It resonates because of what it signifies about what people's identity relationship is to the party that they're supporting.
And also threat because, interestingly enough, in Florida, we think Florida, Cubans, Puerto Ricans more recently, but there's a growing Mexican population there, mainly coming into the Panhandle and Homestead, Florida as agricultural workers. They're only about 7% of the electorate, so they don't really have a political voice. However, they are making a wrestle politically because they've gotten large enough to create reactions to them.
Exactly.
So those anti-immigrant reactions of, hey, are you taking our jobs?
Right.
What's going on here? So Mexican Americans or Mexicans are becoming an issue in Florida, not because of their power, but because of the fear factor.
And that's actually one of the things we've seen, I think, across the experience of the South, particularly, is and the whole country, which is that the place where immigrants are newest are the places where you're seeing the most intense anti-immigration politics and this kind of demagoguery. Whereas the place where they've been the longest, people don't run in New York City. They're not running on any sort of anti-immigrant platform. All right, President Obama, Apple computers, and the state of America when we come back. Two stories in the news last week that seem, I think, at first unrelated. The president gave his State of the Union address themed as a blueprint for an America built to last. And the New York Times ran an investigative piece on conditions for workers in China, where many of Apple's products are assembled, called the iPhone economy. Linking the two stories is Apple's role in America's economy and in the American imagination about American supremacy and fears of American decline. Laurene Powell Jobs, widow of Steve Jobs, sat with Michelle Obama during the president's speech. Clearly, the president wanting to associate himself with one of the most popular brands in America, and I think for a lot of people, a symbol of things that America does right. And then, in the Republican rebuttal to the State of the Union, Indiana Governor Mitch Daniels said this.
Contrary to the president's constant disparagement of people in business, it's one of the noblest of human pursuits. The late Steve Jobs, what a fitting name he had, created more of them than all those stimulus dollars the president borrowed and blew.
Jobs is Jobs' last name, and also jobs are jobs that you work at, just in case you missed that at home when Mitch Daniels was saying that. Just so we're clear, Mitch Daniels is completely sort of embarrassingly wrong on this. Apple employs 43,000 people in the U.S. The most conservative estimate of jobs added by the stimulus from the Congressional Budget Office is 1.2 million. So it's very hard to see how it would be possible for Steve Jobs to have created more jobs than the Recovery Act. But that's neither here nor there, because I think what's so important and interesting is the rhetorical battle about what Apple means and what it means about the future of the American economy, which to me is the central storyline of this campaign, right? What the context of this campaign, I think, is broad anxiety about American decline. Mm-hmm. And that broad anxiety about American decline is based on a cascade of institutional failure that has been the central feature of the last decade of American life, and the Great Recession and the grinding misery that it has imposed on a huge amount of the population, and the way in which horizons have been foreshortened. Apple seems to represent both a conception of American supremacy and the fact of American decline in this way. It is the most popular global brand, one of the most. It just had the most profitable quarter possibly in history, right, in the stock market. It's doing very well. It's made its shareholders a lot of money. And it is the kind of thing that you think only in America could have been made. It sort of combines Northern California bohemian sensibilities and love of design and innovation and inventiveness. That's the part of it that we kind of hold on to. And then the other part of Apple is the 700,000 people that make Apple computers almost entirely in China for very, very low wages in oppressive conditions, largely. And Mike Daisy is here at the table, joining us again on Up, and it's really a pleasure, Mike. First, I want to say that you deserve a tremendous amount of credit personally, because your show about the agony and ecstasy of Steve Jobs is about basically the conditions in the factories in China that make our Apple products, which I own none of, and I think you have single-handedly, I really believe this, single-handedly put this issue front and center in the agenda. What you did was really pioneering, and I think the New York Times, and you did a piece for This American Life, which got a lot of play. When you survey thinking about this at this somewhat abstract level about what Apple means for the American economy, what is your feeling about what it represents about our future, if Apple is indeed the future of the American economy?
Well, we have an enormous amount invested emotionally in Apple now, and a lot of it is because of these devices, specifically iPhones. Like there's something that happened over the last 4 or 5 years as the smartphone evolved and people live with their phones. It changes our relationship to them. None of this would have really happened the way it is right now if Apple didn't have this dominant position in our economy. That wouldn't have happened without the iPhone. But I also think the emotional attachment we have wouldn't happen if we weren't actually living with the phones, like literally bringing them into our beds to check things right before bed.
I've never done that, ever.
Never.
No. The phone is never. Gosh, I mean, I come home, I never touch the phone, but that's just me. But continue. Ask my wife; she'll tell you.
I'm sure. But I do think that it ties to this really deep place, and that's one of the reasons that everyone's hungry to put their stamp on what it means.
Were you surprised to see Steve Jobs' wife in the president's box, and then to see Jobs name checked by Mitch Daniels in the State of the Union, and then the response?
In a way, I wasn't, because I feel like that's been happening a lot. Like both sides keep looking for ways to use Steve Jobs' legacy, and his legacy, is this mercurial thing where depending on what part of it you want to talk about. You just pick the parts that appeal to you and talk about it. I don't think either the Republicans or the Democrats are particularly excited about the part of Steve Jobs' legacy that was on display in the New York Times this week.
Yeah, I want you to talk about that. First, I want to put up a chart about U.S. manufacturing, because so much of what the president has talked about, and I think, Congressman, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this, is about manufacturing jobs decline, the percentage of Americans employed in manufacturing. And what you see is pretty stark. Manufacturing jobs have declined quite rapidly. And that is the story, that is part of the story of the American economy over the last 30 and 40 years, particularly as it regards the kind of economy we have now, the kind of inequality we have now. And I want to talk about what the legacy of that is, Apple's involvement, and what that means for the future when we come right back.
I mean, we think we do know where our shit comes from. We think our shit comes from China. Right? In a generalized way. China. There are dragons there. But it doesn't come from China. It comes from Shenzhen. It's a city, and I am there.
That's a brief clip from the agony and ecstasy of Steve Jobs by our guest, Mike Daisey. Manufacturing has emerged, I think, central to the president's economic message. And Congressman, I'm curious, when you look at these New York Times stories about the story of Apple as a kind of symbol of the larger trends in the economy, which was they had a factory where they used to produce products in California. In the 1990s, they decided it was too expensive. They moved it to China. Everything basically that Apple makes is now there. When you have to talk to your constituents about the economic future of the country, what is the story you tell them about how we move forward, given how our products are produced now, and given the way the sort of global economy works and the relationship we have with China, so dependent on their cheap labor?
It's been a story of America, and the president mentioned Make It in America, which is Steny Hoyer's main issue. We've got to increase our manufacturing. I think Krugman did a great job in the Times 2 days ago, totally dispelling what Mitch Daniels said, and that America's doing fine, and we can do better. But a lot of what they've got in China, and it might have been Kagan's article, I'm not sure, talks about how they've got everything in one place. And a communist society can do that. Now, we don't want to become communist or quote-unquote socialist, but the government can and should help in trying to put areas together to where there can be a synergy that makes manufacturing in America easier, and we give tax incentives, but the government can help that, and the government has a role. And if you get told into this free market theory and the government doesn't help, we'll never be able to compete with China. And I do want to say the president, what he did in saving the jobs in the auto industry was so important to the ancillary industries and automobiles, yes, plus the million-plus people producing cars. You know, that was a wonderful thing that he accomplished in bringing jobs home to America and keeping them. And the Volt is going to be one of the best-selling cars in the world next year.
The Chevy Volt is the electric car that's come out by General Motors.
Right.
Paul Krugman got his Nobel Prize in economic geography, and he did pioneering work in the ways in which there are increasing returns to clusters of industry. He looked at it, and this happens all the time. And there was an amazing quote in the Times article about Apple, which made exactly this point. That said, look, and this was so fascinating about, I thought, that the Times piece, it actually isn't really the wages per se, the actual wages. That's the actual wage labor cost is a fairly small part of why manufacturing is located there. One of the aspects they said was, if you need a gasket, if you need 1,000 gaskets all of a sudden, that's the factory 50 feet away. If you need a bunch of pipes, if you need this or that, everything is right there. It's just this behemoth of industrial output. Esther, please.
Location.
Yes, exactly.
But this is what was interesting to me about reading this. It was 2 points: symbol versus substance. So you have the symbol of the president essentially hijacking that narrative back of America's greatness when the jobs will come back to the United States, and the substantive reality of what Apple is actually doing, and that is the global economy and their push for profit. And some of the reasons listed in the article mean that China represents this place of opportunity in addition to what the United States doesn't represent. Right. So what was really interesting was the fact that one of the points in the article was about when Apple was having trouble getting into Japanese markets. It went to the government to look for help to enter that market. So the essential conclusion was that in the help to advance a company, then a private organization looks for the help from the government, but it wants to own all its profits and not go the extra mile and think about the job market in that space. So it's a symbol versus the substance of the issue.
But I just think that it's somewhat short-sighted to focus on manufacturing jobs. I think that with Steve Jobs, the brilliance was he was looking so forward. And I think that's what everyone... the black and white argument, the good that we focus on, not the dirty underbelly, but his overall philosophy of looking forward. Americans don't want to look backwards. Americans want to look forward. And I think that with these manufacturing jobs, you look at how in the Atlantic article, Making It in America, and the divide between, this is one path of a level 1 job that you really can never, escape and get out of and move ahead just because the manufacturing sector is so fundamentally changed. And so I think that it's much bigger than that, and I think it's a fundamental shift in education within this country that we've got to get back.
That's the argument.
Number 26 in the entire world, the World Economic Forum, America is 26 in education right now.
Mike, when you hear people, this is an argument that you hear, I think, across the political spectrum, particularly, I think, among a kind of sort of establishment. Davos, Tom Friedman make this argument about the problem in America is an education one, and we don't train enough engineers. When you hear these arguments about sort of China's rising supremacy and American relative decline, having been to Shenzhen, having been in the Foxconn factory, what does that provoke in you?
Well, it's really it's interesting because we're all talking here about, like, the Times article makes the point that that one of the things that's so powerful is the synergy where the companies right next to each other. And they actually give as an example of the fact that when new pieces of cut glass came in for the iPhone screens, they woke up all the workers at midnight,
out of the
dormitories, gave them a biscuit and a cup of tea, and set them working immediately. Now, the reason you can do that is because there's no labor standards. Like the reason you can have your workers on call at your beck and call at any moment. So there's an interesting confluence where we're so impressed by their flexibility and how wonderful they are. It's also because we can make them do whatever we want.
An Apple executive actually.
Jobs I don't want to bring to America. And I don't even want in China. That's
right. That I think is the point. I want to talk about how we improve those standards and not just sort of talk about the Chinese are taking our jobs right after we come back from this break.